The dust had not yet settled on the road into Harlan Creek when Esther Rhodes climbed down from the wagon seat with the kind of ease that only comes from a lifetime of hard labor, and every man loitering outside the general store stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1878, and Harlan Creek, Texas, was a town that had seen its share of arrivals. Drifters and gamblers and women in silk dresses who smelled of rosewater and pretense. It had seen snake oil salesmen and circuit preachers, and railroad surveyors with their fancy theodolites and their talk of progress. But it had not seen anything quite like Esther Rhodes, and the men standing outside Patterson's general store sensed that difference before they could name it. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman, with dark chestnut hair wound into a practical knot at the back of her neck. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended at the hem twice over, and her boots were cracked at the toe but well-oiled and functional. What struck the onlookers most, though, was the way she stood after descending from that wagon. Her chin was lifted. Not in arrogance exactly, but in the manner of a woman who had been told more than once that she ought to lower it and had decided, firmly and without bitterness, that she would not. She reached back up into the wagon bed and pulled out a worn leather traveling bag and a wooden crate packed with tools. Not sewing tools, not kitchen tools. A hammer, a draw knife, a brace and bit, 2 good chisels, and a hand plane wrapped carefully in oilcloth. She set the crate down on the boardwalk with a solid thunk and looked around at Harlan Creek like she was taking inventory. The man who had given her the wagon ride from the stage stop in Cutter's Bend tipped his hat and clicked his tongue at his mule and rolled on without ceremony. Esther watched him go and then turned back to the town. 3 blocks of storefronts, a church with a crooked steeple, a livery stable at the far end of the main road with a hand-painted sign so faded the letters were nearly gone. A saloon called the Red Hen, its doors propped open to let out the smell of whiskey and sawdust. And directly across the street from where she stood, a land office with a notice board out front that was so covered in papers they overlapped one another like fish scales. She picked up her bag and her crate and walked toward it. The man behind the desk inside the land office was named Delbert Prout, and he was the kind of man who wore a waistcoat 3 sizes too tight and believed this gave him authority. He looked up at Esther over his spectacles with the expression of a person presented with a moderately interesting but largely inconvenient problem. "Help you," he said. "I'm here about the Calloway homestead," Esther said. 80 acres northeast quarter filed under Rhodes as of February of this year. Delbert set down his pen. "You're E. Rhodes." "Esther Rhodes," she said. "Yes." He blinked several times. "I was expecting a man." "I know," Esther said. "That's why I signed with my initial." It was not an apology. It was a simple statement of strategy, delivered with the same calm she might use to describe the weather. Delbert Prout opened his mouth, and then apparently found no argument that was worth the energy required to make it. He pulled open a drawer, found the relevant file, and processed her paperwork with the efficiency of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was someone else's problem. Esther Rhodes left the land office 15 minutes later with a clear title, directions to her property, and the knowledge that she was going to need to rebuild the fence along the eastern boundary before she could run any animals at all. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before, back in Missouri, and she had learned that fear was most useful when it made you move faster, not when it made you stop. Her father had died the previous autumn, leaving her the small house in St. Louis, and a debt she had paid off by selling that house and every piece of furniture in it except the tools. Her mother had been gone since Esther was 12. She had a younger brother named Thomas who was apprenticed to a blacksmith in Kansas City and doing well enough without her. She had nothing that required her to stay anywhere, and she had always wanted land. The Calloway homestead was 4 miles northeast of town. It had a house on it, technically. A 1-room structure built from timber that had weathered badly and chinked with dried mud, with a stone fireplace that leaned to the left and a roof that had been repaired at some point with flattened tin cans, and was currently doing the work of a roof, only in the most charitable interpretation of that function. There was a well, which worked, and a small barn in better condition than the house, and the 80 acres themselves were good, flat, and covered in the kind of grass that told Esther the soil beneath was rich. She stood in the yard and looked at all of it and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. It was the particular satisfaction of a problem that was large enough to be worthy of her. She rolled up her sleeves and started on the roof. She was 3 days into that work, having made 2 trips back into Harlan Creek for supplies, when she first saw Ira Ellsworth. He was riding in from the south on a buckskin horse that moved with the relaxed, ground-eating walk of an animal that spent a great deal of time covering distance. Ira himself was sitting easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He was 29 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had probably been called handsome once, and had since been improved by wind and sun and the weight of actual living. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed shaving, and the particular posture of a man who was comfortable in the saddle, but not particularly impressed by his own comfort in it. He was, as it happened, the nearest neighbor to the Cowboy homestead, his own spread occupying the land directly to the south, and he had seen the smoke from her chimney for 3 mornings running, and had finally decided to ride over and determine whether whoever had moved onto the old Calloway place was likely to be a problem or a person. He pulled up his buckskin at the edge of the yard and looked up at the woman on the roof, who was nailing down the last of a new cedar shingle she had cut herself, and who did not stop working when she heard him arrive. "That pitch is steeper than it looks from down here," he called up. "It is," Esther agreed, driving the nail home with 3 clean strokes. She turned and looked down at him with that lifted chin, steady and direct. "Can I help you?" Ira looked at her hands. He could see them clearly from where he sat, and they were the hands of someone who had been working with them for years. The knuckles were strong, the palms broad for a woman's, and even from 20 feet away he could see the calluses that had built up along the fingers and across the base of each palm. He looked at her face and at the way she was looking at him, not with suspicion exactly but with the careful, unapologetic assessment of someone who had learned to take the measure of people quickly and accurately. He said something then that he had not planned to say, and that surprised him even as he was saying it. "Finally," he said, almost to himself, and then louder clearly with a directness that matched her own. "Finally, someone real." Esther Rhodes studied him from up on that roof for a long moment. "Excuse me." He pulled off his hat and held it against his chest, which was more of a courtesy than he offered most people. "Ira Ellsworth. I run the spread to the south of you. I've been watching people move onto this land for 7 years, and every one of them either left inside of a season or ran themselves into the ground because they thought the land owed them something. You've been here 3 days and you're already fixing the roof yourself." He looked at the neat row of new shingles she had laid. "And you're doing it right." Esther came down the ladder with the same ease she had shown climbing down from the wagon, collected her hammer from where it hung at her belt, and walked over to him. She did not put her hand up to shield her eyes against the sun, though it was in her face. She just looked at him squarely. "Esther Rhodes," she said. "I am fixing the roof myself because it needs fixing, and I am here and I know how. That does not seem remarkable to me." "It doesn't," Ira said. "That's exactly the point." They regarded each other for a moment, and something passed between them in that silence that neither of them would have been able to name yet, but that both of them would later identify as the moment when the shape of their lives changed. "I expect you'll be wanting to know if I'm trouble," Esther said. "Are you?" "Only for people who get in my way," she said. And she said it without a smile but with something in her eyes that was close enough to humor that Ira felt it. "In that case," he said, "you won't have any from me." He settled his hat back on his head. "I've got a buckboard coming through from Harlan Creek on Thursday with a load of timber. I ordered more than I need. If you want to barter for some of it, I'd consider an offer." Esther looked at the house. Then she looked back at him. "What kind of barter?" My fencing along the north boundary needs new posts. It would take me 2 weeks to get to it myself. I expect it would take you less." She looked at his hands then. They were working hands too, she noticed. Honest hands. "Show me the boundary," she said. He did. And she walked the whole length of it with him, 400 yards through knee-high spring grass. And she asked 3 questions about the soil and 2 about the water table and none at all about anything personal. And by the time they reached the end of the fence line and turned back, Ira Ellsworth had the uncommon experience of feeling entirely comfortable in the presence of someone he had known for less than an hour. "I'll have your posts done inside of a week," Esther said when they were back at the yard. "In exchange for the timber plus the use of your buckboard to bring it over." "Done," Ira said. He rode back south, and Esther stood in the yard and watched him go, and she told herself very firmly that she had not come 400 miles to be distracted by a man with dark eyes and a straight way of speaking, and that she meant to stick to that resolution. She was not, as it turned out, particularly good at sticking to that resolution, but she did not learn that for a while yet. The timber arrived Thursday as promised. Ira drove the buckboard himself, and he helped her unload it without being asked, and he did not make any remarks about the plans she had drawn on a piece of brown paper for what she intended to do with it, which were detailed and precise, and showed a woman who had been thinking about structures and their construction for a very long time. "Where did you learn to draw plans like that?" he asked, holding the paper carefully because the wind was up. "My father was a carpenter," Esther said, lifting an end of a heavy beam without waiting for him. "He caught the other end automatically. I worked with him from the time I was 8. And your mother? Gone when I was 12, fever." She said it simply, not as an invitation for sympathy but as information. "She was a practical woman. She taught me to read and do figures and to make decisions without waiting for someone else to make them first." "She sounds like she was something," Ira said. "She was," Esther said, and her voice held something tender beneath the plainness of the words. "She really was." They carried the timber together into the barn for storage, and when they were finished, Esther brought out a tin cup of water from the well for each of them, and they sat on the top rail of the fence that surrounded the small paddock and drank. "You going to run cattle?" Ira asked. "Milk cow and a pair of draft horses to start," Esther said. "Maybe 6 ewes. I want to build the fencing before I bring in any animals. Then plant the south field in sorghum." She looked out over her land with that same focused, proprietary look he had noticed before, like a woman reading a map she had made herself. "This soil is better than I expected. It'll grow well with some attention." "It will," Ira agreed. He had known this land for years. "The whole northeast section of this county drains well. Cowboy never did right by it." "I intend to," Esther said. There was a pause, and then Ira said, because he was a direct man and he had been wondering, "Where are you from originally?" "St. Louis, before that Ohio, when I was small." She glanced at him sideways. "You, born in Tennessee. My father brought us out here in '69 when I was 20. He took the land I'm on now and worked it for 2 years and then got sick and I took over." He said it without drama. "He's been gone 5 years." "I'm sorry," Esther said. "He was a good man," Ira said. "He would have said the same thing you did about the soil." They sat in the cooling evening air and did not say much more, and it was a comfortable silence, which surprised them both. Ira left before dark and Esther went inside her half-repaired house and ate a supper of cornbread and salt pork and thought about the fence posts she needed to cut in the morning. She did not think about Ira Ellsworth for very long before she went to sleep. This was a lie, but she was a practical woman, and she considered small lies to herself to be a reasonable management of her own interior life. She had his fence posts done in 5 days. They were clean and straight and properly set, and Ira said nothing about them being better than what he would have managed himself, but she could see that he was thinking it by the way he ran his hand along one post and then another without comment, just nodding. "We're square," she said. "More than square," he said. "You're owed 2 days. "I'll take them in company," she said, and immediately was not sure why she had said that, but she did not take it back. When you have work that needs 2 sets of hands, come find me." He looked at her with something shifting in his expression that she could not fully read. "All right," he said. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm developed between them that was practical and real and entirely without pretense. Harlan Creek was the kind of town where people noticed things and made them their business, and the town began to notice that Esther Rhodes and Ira Ellsworth were spending a fair portion of their time on each other's land. Lottie Beaumont, who ran the dry goods section of Patterson's general store with her husband and had opinions about most things, said to Esther one morning while measuring out flour that it was unusual for a woman alone on a homestead. "It is," Esther agreed, packing the flour into her bag. "You'll want looking after," Lottie said, in a tone that was simultaneously kind and pointed. "I have looked after myself for some time," Esther said pleasantly. "I expect I'll manage." "Ira Ellsworth is a good man," Lottie said, which was not a subtlety at all. "I expect he is," Esther said. She paid for her flour and left, and Lottie Beaumont said to her husband afterward that Rhodes woman was going to be a fixture in Harlan Creek, because she had exactly the kind of spine the place needed more of. What was true, and what Esther only began to recognize fully in the 4th week of her time on the homestead, was that when Ira Ellsworth was not around, she noticed his absence in a specific and inconvenient way. Not with loneliness, exactly. She had been alone before and knew how to be with it, but with a kind of background awareness, like the way you notice a clock only when it stops ticking. He had a habit of arriving in the morning with his own coffee in a battered tin pot when he knew he was coming to help with something, and she had a habit of having biscuits or cornbread ready, and they had never spoken about this arrangement, but it had developed with the easy inevitability of things that simply make sense. They would eat at the small table she had built from the timber he had provided, and they would talk about the work for the day, and sometimes about other things, and the other things got longer and more frequent as the weeks went on. He told her about the cattle drive he had done the previous year, pushing 200 head up to the railhead in Abilene with a crew of 4, and the particular misery of 3 days of rain, and a river crossing with a spooked herd. He told her about the man he'd hired the year before who had turned out to be running from a trouble in New Mexico that was not entirely his own making, and how Ira had helped him sort it out, and the man had moved on and sent a letter from Colorado the following spring to say he had married a schoolteacher. She told him about learning to read plans at her father's knee, and the first time she had built something from start to finish on her own, a chicken coop when she was 14 that her father had declared architecturally superior to some barns he had built for hire. She told him about the debt that had followed her father's death, not with self-pity, but with the clear-eyed accounting of someone who had moved through a hard thing and come out the other side with their character intact. She told him about deciding to go west and sitting alone in the emptied house in St. Louis with the deed to the land she had bought sight unseen and a feeling in her chest that was entirely terrifying and entirely right. "Were you scared?" he asked her once. "Yes," she said immediately, and he liked that. She never dressed her honesty up. But scared is just your body reminding you that something matters. I have found it useful to treat it that way. Ira was quiet for a moment. "I've never heard anyone say that before," he said, "but I think it's the most sensible thing I've heard about fear." June arrived, which in Harlan Creek, Texas, meant the heat came on with both hands, a dry, relentless press that sat on everything from before noon until well after dark. The wells held, which was a blessing. The sorghum Esther had planted was coming up green and strong in the south field, and she had acquired, through a trade with a farmer named Gustafson who had moved on to New Mexico, a milk cow of advanced years but solid temperament named Margaret, and a pair of draft horses, one gray and one red roan, that she named Patterson and Delbert after the 2 men in Harlan Creek who had seemed most surprised by her presence. Ira had laughed when she told him the horses' names. It was one of the few times she had heard him laugh fully, and it did something to the architecture of her feelings about him that she could not repair afterward. He came over on a Tuesday in the second week of June with a look on his face that was different from his usual expression, which was thoughtful and unhurried. This was a tighter look, something pulling at the edges of it. "I have a problem," he said without preamble, which she appreciated. "Tell me," she said. The problem was this. His best hand, a man named Pete Cruz who had been with him for 3 years and was worth 3 ordinary cowboys in terms of his knowledge of cattle and the land, had injured his leg badly in a fall from a horse 5 days ago. The leg was not broken, but it was strained severely at the knee, and the doctor in Harlan Creek had told Pete that he needed to keep off it for no fewer than 3 weeks. This left Ira with 47 head of cattle that needed moving from the southern pasture, which was drying out early this year, to the northern section of his land near the creek, where the grass was still green and the water was reliable. He could not move 47 head of cattle with one man alone. Had a second hand, a young man named Caleb Marsh who was 19 and willing but had only been doing this work for 1 season and was not confident enough yet on his own to handle a herd that size without experienced guidance. Esther listened to all of this and then said, "I can work cattle." Ira looked at her carefully. "It's hard going in this heat. So is putting up fencing," she said. "And I did that in May, which was nearly as bad." "It's 4 days of work," he said. "Maybe 5. "I'm aware of what moving cattle involves," she said. "My father had a small herd when I was growing up. I've done this before." She paused. "Not 47 head, but the principle is the same." Ira thought about this. He was not a man who doubted other people's stated abilities as a rule, having found that most people, when they claimed to know something, generally did know it. And he had watched Esther Rhodes work for 2 months now, and he had never once seen her attempt something she was not capable of. "All right," he said. "Starting Wednesday if the weather holds." The weather held, more or less. It was ferociously hot, and the dust was a constant companion. And on the second day, there was a brief fear storm that swept through in the late afternoon and spooked the rear third of the herd into a confused mill that took 40 minutes and a good deal of patient, skilled riding to sort out. Esther handled that situation with a competence that Ira watched with something that had moved well past admiration by this point, though he had not said so. Caleb Marsh, who was 19 and had the particular openness of the very young, said to Ira on the 3rd evening while they were eating by a small fire they had built on the northern pasture, "Miss Rhodes is the best rider I've ever seen that isn't you." "She is," Ira said. "She doesn't fuss," Caleb said, with the honest appreciation of someone who had grown up around people who fussed a great deal. "She just does what needs doing." Ira looked across the fire to where Esther was tending to Patterson's left foreleg, which had picked up a small stone earlier in the day. She was working in the firelight, her hair loose from its knot now after 4 days of outdoor work, her movements sure and deliberate. She had a smear of dust on her jaw and she did not seem to notice or care. "She does," Ira said, and his voice was quiet when he said it, quieter than Caleb noticed. They finished moving the herd on the afternoon of the 4th day, and Ira paid Esther for the work in cash, which she accepted without demurring, and then they rode back to her land in the cooling evening and watered the horses at her well and sat on the front step of her house, which she had fully repaired by this time, and drank water and did not talk for a while. Then Ira said, "I need to say something." Esther looked at him. "I have been," he said carefully, in the manner of a man who says important things slowly because he means them precisely, "finding reasons to be on your land and in your company since about the 3rd week of April, and I believe you have noticed." "I have," Esther said. "I am not a man who makes speeches," he said, "and I am not going to pretend I have found the right words for this. But I would like to know if what I am feeling is something that goes in one direction only, or if it goes in two." Esther looked out at her land in the low evening light, the south field green and orderly, the house solid and repaired and hers. Then she looked at him. "It goes in two," she said. Ira let out a breath, slow and controlled, but she could see what it cost him to keep it that controlled. "All right," he said. "Then I would like to court you properly if you're willing. I am not asking for anything you don't want to give. I just want to be honest about where I'm standing." Esther thought about her mother, who had been a practical woman and had married a practical man, and had loved him truly and deeply until the fever took her, and who had told Esther once, when Esther was 10 years old and asking about how you knew when something was real, that real things felt like ground underfoot. They felt like something you could stand on. Standing next to Ira Ellsworth felt like something she could stand on. "I'm willing," she said. He did not take her hand or kiss her or make any dramatic gesture. He just nodded with a look on his face that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him and said, "Good." And somehow that was exactly right. Courting in Harlan Creek in 1878 was a largely public affair, which meant that by the following Sunday, when Ira Ellsworth and Esther Rhodes arrived at the small church together and sat in the same pew, the entire town knew. Lottie Beaumont caught Esther's eye during the singing and gave her a look of unrestrained satisfaction that Esther chose not to acknowledge, though she appreciated the warmth behind it. The preacher, a man named Hobbs who had the particular gift of delivering a sermon with neither too much fire nor too much water, but just the right amount of both, shook Ira's hand afterward and said it was good to see him bringing company, and shook Esther's hand and said he had heard good things about her work on the Calloway land, and she said she hoped to keep justifying the good reports. The town, as towns do, had opinions. Most of them were positive. Esther had made an impression in 2 months that some people took years to make, partly because she was competent and partly because she was fair. She paid her debts promptly, and she did not ask for credit she did not have, and she did not put on airs, and she helped where help was needed without making a ceremony of it. Old Gustafson, before he had left for New Mexico, had said that the Rhodes woman was the best trade he had made in a year, which in Gustafson's particular economy of language was an extravagant endorsement. There was one person in Harlan Creek who did not share this general positive view, and that was a man named Cole Whitmore, who ran the Red Hen Saloon and had, as it emerged over the summer, been watching the Calloway land with designs of his own. Whitmore was 38, broad and self-assured in the particular way of men who had never had their self-assurance seriously challenged, and he came to see Esther on a Wednesday morning in early July with the expression of a man delivering a favor. "I'll give you $400 for the Calloway parcel," he said, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands and a smile that was perfectly constructed and entirely empty. Esther was sharpening her drawknife on a whetstone at the time. She continued sharpening it for a moment before she looked up. "It's not for sale," she said. Whitmore's smile adjusted slightly. "500, he said. "That's more than you paid and more than it's worth." "It's worth more than you think," Esther said, "and it's still not for sale." "You're a woman alone," Whitmore said, shifting his approach. "This is hard country. 4 days a week you're over at Ellsworth's place, and that leaves your land unsupervised. Things happen to unattended land." Esther set down the drawknife and stood up. She looked at Whitmore with the kind of calm that is the product not of ease but of very clear thinking. "Are you threatening me, or are you making a business proposition?" she said. "Because if you are threatening me, you should know that I will go directly to the county sheriff in Cutter's Bend and file a complaint. And the sheriff there is a man named Harker who thinks very poorly of men who use threatening language with women on their own land, because his own mother lost her homestead that way. And if you are making a business proposition, my answer remains no." She paused. "So which is it?" Whitmore stared at her. His smile was entirely gone now. "Neither," he said after a moment, with the clipped delivery of a man who is retreating without being willing to acknowledge that he is retreating. "I'm just asking." "You have your answer," Esther said. He left. Esther told Ira about it that evening when he came over to help her with the kitchen addition she was framing out. She told it simply and without embellishment, and Ira listened with the particular stillness that she had come to recognize as the way he held himself when something made him angry, and he was deciding what to do about it. "He does things like that," Ira said. "He wanted Pete Crew's land last year and made the same kind of hints. Pete told him to go to the devil." "Good advice," Esther said. "I can go have a word with him," Ira said, not aggressively but plainly. "You don't need to," Esther said. "I handled it." "I know you handled it," Ira said, and the warmth in his voice was such that she felt it move through her like sunlight through glass. "But you're not alone in this now." She looked at him, and what she felt in that moment was something she had to stand very still to manage, because it was large and it was real and it had not asked her permission before arriving. "No," she said, "I'm not." They framed out 3 walls of the kitchen addition that evening, working by lantern light after the sun went down, and they talked while they worked, which they always did, and the conversation moved easily from practical things to other things. And at some point while they were discussing the question of whether the South Field would do better with a second crop in September or whether the soil needed to rest, Ira stopped what he was doing and said her name. "Esther." She looked up. He crossed the short distance between them and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way you handle something valuable, and kissed her. It was a straightforward kiss, honest and warm and without any performance in it, and Esther stood in the lantern light of her half-built kitchen and kissed him back with both hands flat against his chest, and she could feel his heart under her palms, and it was beating in the same complicated, hopeful way as her own. When they stepped back from each other, Ira's expression was something she had never seen on him before and would spend many years afterward finding beautiful. It was open. Completely, helplessly open. "I've been wanting to do that for 2 months, he said. "I know," she said. "I have been waiting for you to be ready." He laughed at that, soft and startled, and she smiled. And in the lantern light of the kitchen she was building with her own hands on her own land. Esther Rhodes thought about how some things arrive when you have finally stopped expecting them and started simply living in their direction. The summer moved through its long hot weeks, and the courtship moved with it, easy and deep and grounded in the dailiness of 2 people who were both, fundamentally, more comfortable with honesty than with performance. They rode out on Sundays when the work allowed, exploring the countryside around Harlan Creek, which was vast and various and beautiful in its particular way, the red soil and the cedar breaks, and the long blue distances that opened up when you got to high ground. Ira knew this land as well as any man alive, and he took pleasure in sharing it with someone who received it with the same kind of attention he gave it. Esther had a habit of stopping to examine things, a particular rock formation or an unusual stand of grass, or the way water moved in the small creek that ran along the western boundary of his land, and asking questions that were sharp and curious, and showed that she was always thinking beneath the surface of what was visible. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the loneliness of the early years when his father was still alive but failing, and the land was barely producing, and the nearest neighbor was 6 miles off, and he had sometimes gone 2 weeks without a real conversation. About the particular quality of grief that comes not in a sudden wave but in small repeated discoveries of absence, finding his father's hat on its hook one morning, and feeling the loss as freshly as the day it happened. She told him about her father's last months, which she had managed alone while continuing to work, because there was no one else. She told him about the silence of the house after, which was a different quality of silence from the silence she had grown up in. She told him about the strength she had found in deciding to move west, and how that decision had felt like a turning point not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of herself. "I knew who I was before," she said one afternoon, sitting beside the creek with her feet off the bank above the water, "but I didn't fully trust it. Being afraid and still doing the thing teaches you to trust yourself." Ira was beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched when either of them moved, which was a pleasantness that neither of them pretended not to notice. "You know who you are," he said, "clearer than anyone I have ever met." "You know who you are too," she said. "Do I?" You work your land with your whole self, she said. You treat your hands fairly, and you are honest even when it costs you, and you do not pretend to be someone you are not. That is knowing who you are. He was quiet for a moment, then, you see things very clearly. My mother taught me to look, she said. She said most unhappiness comes from people not being willing to look at what is actually in front of them. She sounds like she was a wise woman, he said. The wisest I ever knew, Esther said. I have been trying to live up to her for most of my life. She said it without sadness, just honestly, and Ira reached over and took her hand, which she let him hold, and they sat by the creek in the afternoon light, and the summer turned slowly above them. The matter of Cole Whitmore resolved itself in August in a way that Esther had not anticipated, but that the town seemed largely unsurprised by. Whitmore, apparently undeterred by his rejection, had made the same kind of approach to a pair of brothers named the Decker boys who had a small farm on the western edge of town, and the Decker boys, who were both large and had short tempers, had introduced him to the sheriff who passed through Harlan Creek once a month from Cutter's Bend. The sheriff took statements. Whitmore was not arrested because statements alone in 1878 did not constitute the kind of evidence that produced arrests, but the sheriff spoke with him in the way that sheriffs spoke with men they were watching, and the town made a collective decision after that to give Cole Whitmore's saloon less of its custom. Whitmore gave Esther's land no more attention after that, and Esther did not give him any of hers. In September, the sorghum came in, and it came in better than Esther had projected, which put her in a very good position financially for the winter. She sold the bulk of it to a buyer in Cutter's Bend and reinvested the money in improvements to the barn, in 6 ewes from a farmer east of town named Bauer who kept good sheep, and in the materials for a proper sleeping loft in the house. She also acquired, through Ira's introduction, a dog. He was a large, unlovely, warmly affectionate dog of indeterminate breed named Sergeant, who had belonged to one of Ira's retiring hands and needed a new situation. Sergeant decided within 48 hours that the homestead was his, and that Esther was his person, and that Ira, who visited very frequently, was acceptable. He communicated these decisions by following Esther everywhere she went and barking once, briefly and authoritatively, at anyone else who arrived at the property, until Esther confirmed they were permitted. "Your dog is a better judge of character than most people," Ira observed, watching Sergeant escort the male rider off the property one October morning. "He is," Esther said affectionately. The autumn settled over Harlan Creek with the particular golden quality that the Texas Hill Country produced in October, the oaks turning, and the evenings coming earlier and the air losing its summer press and becoming something clear and gentle. It was beautiful country in autumn, and Esther, who had been too busy surviving the summer to spend much time simply observing, found herself taking it in with something like gratitude. It was in October that Ira asked her to marry him. He did it the way he did everything important, which was directly and without decoration, and he did it at her kitchen table over the morning coffee, which she thought afterward was entirely characteristic and entirely right. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have known it since July, and I have been working out how to say it since August, and I have concluded that the most honest way to say it is simply to say it." Esther looked at him across the table. She had been thinking about this too since July, and she had been approaching it in her own way, which was to examine it carefully and from multiple angles and to hold it up to the light and see if it remained true. It had remained true. "I want to marry you too," she said, "but I need to be clear about a few things first." "Tell me," he said, which she loved about him because he always said that. He always wanted to hear the actual thing. "This is my land," she said. "I keep the deed in my own name. I do not become an extension of you or your land. We are 2 people with 2 properties who choose each other. We decide to run them together. That is a decision we make together, but I want it understood from the beginning." "Agreed," Ira said, without hesitation and without looking like he was making a concession. He simply agreed as if this was obvious. "And I want a real partnership," she said. I want my opinion to carry the same weight as yours in decisions that affect us both. Esther, he said, with a look on his face that was patient and warm, when have I ever not listened to your opinion? She thought about it. Never, she admitted. Because you are the smartest person I know, he said, and he was not flattering her. He was saying it with the same evenness with which he said everything true, and I would be a fool to not listen to you. She leaned across the table and kissed him, quick and certain, and when she sat back she was smiling in a way that she could not always manage to manage. Yes, she said, I will marry you. They were married in November, in the church in Harlan Creek with Preacher Hobbs officiating and the whole town in attendance, because Harlan Creek was the kind of place where a wedding was a community event and no one was going to miss it. Lottie Beaumont cried, which she denied afterward but which her husband confirmed. Caleb Marsh, who was now Ira's full hand and had grown into his confidence considerably over the summer, stood as witness. Pete Cruz, whose leg had healed well by this point, stood with him. Esther's brother Thomas rode up from Kansas City for the occasion, arriving 2 days before the wedding and spending those 2 days with his eyes wide at the land and the life his sister had built, saying at one point to Ira with the frank admiration of a 23-year-old, I've always known she could do anything she set her mind to. I just didn't think she'd set her mind to all of it at once. Ira had liked Thomas immediately, which was, Esther thought, because they were both the kind of men who said what they meant and did what they said. Esther wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Cutter's Bend, a deep blue wool that was both practical and beautiful, and she walked into the church on Thomas's arm with her chin lifted and her hands calloused and her eyes clear, and when she reached Ira at the front of the church and he looked at her, she saw in his face the same thing she felt in her chest, an undecorated, unashamed, entirely real happiness. The ceremony was simple. The vows were traditional. When Preacher Hobbs pronounced them married and Ira kissed her in front of the whole town, someone in the back rows let out a whoop that was probably Pete Cruz, and the church filled with laughter and the kind of noise that happy people make. Thomas stayed through the week and helped them begin the process of connecting the two properties, not by merging them legally, but by opening a gate in the shared fence line and building a good solid road between the two houses, which Esther and Ira would use so frequently over the coming years that it eventually became the most well-traveled stretch of private land in that part of the county. When Thomas left, he shook Ira's hand and hugged his sister for a long time and said into her hair, "You were right to come here." "I know," she said. Life in winter was different from life in the seasons that had brought her here, and Esther found its rhythm satisfying in new ways. The days were shorter and the work was different, more internal, more about maintenance and preparation, and there was more time in the evenings, which meant more time at the table with Ira, talking by lamplight. They talked about everything: history and agriculture, and the state of the cattle market, and the questions of the day, which were considerable in 1878, including the question of what was being done to the Plains tribes, which was a subject that Esther approached with the clear-eyed willingness to acknowledge what was wrong that she brought to all other subjects. She had traveled enough of the West by this point, even in her short time, to see the shape of what was happening to people who had lived on this land long before any of them, and she did not look away from it. "It's a wrong being done in broad daylight," she said one night, "and most people choose not to see it because it is convenient to not see it." Ira agreed with her. He had seen what happened at the edges of the frontier, the dispossession and the violence of it, and it sat badly with him. "I don't know what one person does about it," he said honestly. "You start with seeing it clearly," Esther said, "and you do not participate in it and you do not benefit from land that was taken by force when you can help it." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about that sometimes, about this land." "The Calloway place was never contested territory," Ira said. "It was surveyed and filed in 81 different ways, but that doesn't mean there isn't a larger question." "No," she agreed. "There is always a larger question." They were not naive about the world they lived in. They were people of their time and place, and they understood the structures around them even when those structures were unjust, and they moved through them with as much integrity as the structures allowed. It was not enough in the broad view of history, and they knew that, but it was what they had. Winter gave way to the spring of 1879, which came to Harlan Creek with a green abundance that suggested the previous year's good sorghum crop had not been a fluke. Esther planted the south field again and added the north field to her rotation, having spent the winter improving the soil with a composting system she had designed herself, which Ira had looked at with the expression of a man who was continually learning things from his wife, and had decided this was one of the great pleasures of his life. In April, Esther told Ira she was pregnant. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table. In the direct way she told him everything, and Ira went very still for a moment in the way he did when something moved him deeply, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that was so openly moved that she had to take a breath to stay level herself. "How are you feeling?" he said, and his first question was about her, which she filed away as another thing she loved about him. "Well," she said. "A little unsteady in the mornings, but it passes." "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need to keep working," she said. "The same as always. I am not ill, Ira, I am pregnant." "There is a difference." "I know there is," he said. "I'm not going to wrap you in cotton. I just want to know what would help." "What would help," she said, "is knowing that you are going to be as direct and honest with me about all of this as you are about everything else, and not start treating me like I'm made of something that breaks." "Esther," he said, with that particular warmth in her name that he had developed over the months of knowing her, "you are the least breakable person I have ever met." She squeezed his hands. "Good, then we understand each other." They did. The summer of 1879 was a full one. Esther worked her land through June and into July with the same deliberate, capable energy she had always brought to it, making adjustments for the pregnancy as needed but not stopping. Ira was a steady presence, neither hovering nor absent, which was exactly right. He took on more of the heavier work without making speeches about it, simply appearing when it needed doing and getting it done, and Esther, who had a very accurate sense of when she was being helped well and when she was being managed, let him. In August, the well at the homestead, which was the original Calloway well and had always been adequate but never generous, started running low. Esther and Ira spent a week studying the land carefully, Esther examining the drainage patterns she had been observing for a year and a half, and identified a better location 20 yards to the west. They hired a well digger from Cutter's Bend and had it done inside 2 weeks, and the new well produced water so clean and so plentiful that Esther stood at its edge the first morning it was open and drank a cup of it, and felt the deep satisfaction of a problem fully solved. Her son was born in October 1879, healthy and large and loudly indignant about his arrival in the world, in the repaired and improved house on the homestead that Esther had built up from almost nothing, attended by the doctor from Harlan Creek and Lottie Beaumont, who had appointed herself as the practical community support for such events, and was, it turned out, remarkably good at it. Ira was present, which was not universally common at the time, but Esther had said simply that she wanted him there, and he had said there was nowhere else he would be. He held her hand through the hard parts and said very little, which was what she needed, and when the doctor placed the baby in his arms first so Esther could rest for a moment, Ira held his son with the careful, astonished tenderness of a man receiving the most important thing he has ever been entrusted with, and Esther watched his face from the pillow and felt something so vast and good that she could not contain it. "He looks like you," Ira said. "He looks like nobody yet," Esther said. "Give him a few days." They named him James for Esther's father. James Ellsworth grew up between 2 properties and 2 parents who were, in their particular and practical and deeply felt way, entirely devoted to each other and to him. He grew up watching his mother build things and plan things and work the land with her calloused hands and her proud, unapologetic bearing. He grew up watching his father manage cattle and ride the range and make decisions with the same steadiness and honesty he had always had. He grew up in a house where conversations were direct and opinions were welcome and hard things were acknowledged, and good things were celebrated without excess but with genuine warmth. Harlan Creek grew through the late 1870s and into the 1880s. The railroad came through in 1881, not through Harlan Creek itself but close enough, to the town of Deming 12 miles to the east, that the economic effect was considerable. Cattle prices improved. Land values rose. The town got a proper schoolhouse in 1880, which Esther contributed to both financially and in terms of her labor, spending 2 weekends helping to frame and finish the building, and donating a set of arithmetic and reading primers she had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis. The schoolhouse made the teacher question, which in Harlan Creek in 1880 was a pressing one. The teacher who came the first year was a young man from Ohio named Fredericks, who was earnest and not particularly well suited to the frontier, and left at the end of the year. The teacher who came the following year was a woman named Miriam Sands, 28 years old, with a degree from a normal school in Tennessee, and a calm, authoritative manner that the children responded to immediately. Miriam Sands became one of Esther's closest friends over the following years, which was a friendship based on the particular pleasure of 2 intelligent women who respected each other's minds and did not require each other to be anything other than what they were. Miriam was also, as it happened, exactly the kind of person that Caleb Marsh, now 22, and running his own small operation on a piece of land he had purchased east of town with 3 years of carefully saved wages, had absolutely no idea what to do with. This situation resolved itself over the course of 1881 with the assistance of some frank advice from Esther and some amused but genuine support from Ira. And Caleb Marsh married Miriam Sands in the summer of 1882, in the same church where Esther and Ira had married, with the same preacher, and with considerable satisfaction from everyone who had watched it developing. Harlan Creek was, by 1882, a real town with real permanence, and the people who had built it were proud of that permanence in the way of people who know what it cost. In the spring of 1882, Esther and Ira made the decision they had been considering for 2 years, to consolidate the operations of both properties under a single working arrangement. Not a merger of legal ownership, as Esther had always been clear about, but a working partnership in which the 2 spreads were managed together, the cattle from Ira's land and the crops from Esther's, the labor shared and the income shared and the decisions shared. They drew up the arrangement themselves, with the help of a lawyer in Cutter's Bend, and it was a document that the lawyer said was one of the most clearly reasoned partnership agreements he had ever seen, and he did not say this to flatter them. The combined operation prospered. Esther's soil management practices, which had been considered somewhat experimental when she had started them, turned out to be consistently productive year over year, and she had begun sharing them informally with other farmers in the area with results that were sufficiently good that she was invited twice to speak at a regional agricultural association meeting in Cutter's Bend, which she did. To rooms full of men who had largely not expected a woman to know what she was talking about, and who came away from both talks with the kind of respect that is involuntary, because it is produced by genuine competence. Ira sat in the back of the hall both times, and both times he had the same expression, which was pride so steady and so complete that it required no expression at all, just a quiet presence that said everything. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1883, which was a season of particular beauty in Harlan Creek, the rains having come well and the land being green and generous. She was born on a Tuesday morning when the mockingbirds were singing in the cedar tree outside the window, and she was healthy and small and furious in the way of people who have strong opinions from the very first moment. James, who was 3.5 and had been very carefully prepared for a sibling, stood at the edge of the bed and looked at his sister with the solemn assessment of a child who had inherited both his parents' tendency to look at things carefully before forming a view. "She's very red," he said. "You are very red too," Esther said. "She is going to be a lot of work," James said. "Yes," Ira said from beside the bed, "she is." They named her Clara, for the grandmother Esther had never known, but had heard about from her father in terms of such warmth and frequency that Clara felt like a real presence in the family history. Clara Ellsworth was, in fact, a lot of work, in the very best possible way. She was curious and loud and fearless, and by the time she was 2, she was following Esther around the property with the absolute conviction that everything her mother did was worth observing, which Esther found to be the most humbling and motivating form of attention she had ever received. James grew into a serious and capable boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision of thought, and who was going to be, everyone agreed, the kind of man who got things done without making noise about it. He loved the land with the same unconditional affection that both his parents had for it, and from the time he was old enough to be useful, he was out on it at every opportunity. The years that followed were the years that make a life rather than a story. They were full of work and seasonal difficulty, and the occasional crisis of weather or illness or market that farm life in the West produces. And they were full of the good particular pleasures of people who love their work and each other, and the place they have made their own. Pete Cruz, who had healed fully from his knee injury and had continued with Ira through all of this, married a widow named Frances Aldrich who had moved to Harlan Creek with her 2 daughters in 1881, and settled nearby, and became such a fixture of the Ellsworth operation that the line between employee and family had long since blurred into something more like the latter. Thomas Rhodes came to visit every year or 2 from Kansas City, where he had established himself as a skilled blacksmith with his own shop and a good reputation, and he always stayed for 2 weeks and spent half of each visit marveling openly at what Esther had built, and the other half being dragged around the property by James and Clara, who adored their uncle. In 1884, Harlan Creek got a newspaper, a modest weekly enterprise called the Creek Gazette, and in its second issue there was a small article about the Ellsworth homesteads and their agricultural methods that Esther had been asked to contribute to, and which she wrote with her usual precision and without any self-congratulation, simply describing what she had learned about the land and what worked and what did not. The article was, by local standards, widely read, and she received 3 letters from farmers in neighboring counties asking specific questions, which she answered in full. Ira read the article the evening the paper came out, at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and when he finished it, he set the paper down and looked at his wife across the table and said, "I want you to know that I am aware that I am the luckiest man in this part of Texas." Esther looked up from the sock she was mending. "Only this part. I did not want to overclaim," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile she kept for him, the one that was not held back by the dignity she carried in the world, the one that was just warmth and ease and the pleasure of being completely known by someone and having them stay. "I am not doing badly myself," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight, in the house she had rebuilt from almost nothing, on the land she had chosen with her whole self, in the life that had assembled itself out of courage and work, and the improbable good luck of arriving in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878 with calloused hands and a proud chin, and finding, across a dirt yard, a man who looked at all of it and said exactly the right thing. The winter of 1884 was hard, as some winters were, with 3 weeks of ice and a killing frost that took a portion of the winter wheat and forced Esther and Ira to make some adjustments to their planting plans for the spring. They sat at the kitchen table in January and looked at the figures together, Esther with her pencil and her brown paper, Ira watching her work and adding the details from his side of the operation. And in 2 hours, they had a revised plan that was, as Ira said, actually an improvement over the original because the frost had forced them to rethink a rotation they had gotten too comfortable with. This was what they did. They solved things together, and they did it well. James turned 5 in October 1884, and Esther took him to the schoolhouse for the first time and watched him walk in with his father's steady stride and his head up, and she felt the particular piercing pride of a parent watching a child take a step away, and held Ira's hand very tightly without saying anything, and Ira held her hand back without saying anything either. Clara, at 1.5, was unimpressed by the ceremony of education and wanted to know where the horses were. Spring 1885 brought with it a new neighbor, a family named Vasquez who had purchased a parcel to the east that had been empty for some time. Jose and Maria Vasquez, with their 3 children and Jose's elderly mother, arrived on a Saturday in April with a wagon so loaded it was remarkable it had made the journey, and were greeted at their property line by Esther Rhodes Ellsworth, who had made a pot of beans and brought cornbread, and who helped unload their wagon for 3 hours before riding home, leaving behind both the food and a list of the most useful practical information about the land and the town that any newcomer to Harlan Creek had ever received. Ira was not surprised by any of this. He had known for years that this was how Esther moved through the world, not with a view to impression, but with the straightforward conviction that people who needed help ought to receive it. The Vasquez family became good neighbors and, in time, good friends. Maria Vasquez had a knowledge of dry-land farming techniques that supplemented and in some areas surpassed Esther's own, and the 2 women spent many afternoons over the following years in a conversation about soil and water and growing things that was one of the most productive agricultural exchanges in that part of the county, whether the county knew it or not. In the autumn of 1885, Ira and Esther rode out on a Sunday afternoon, the 2 of them alone while James was at Pete Crew's place with Pete's stepchildren, and Clara was napping under Lottie Beaumont's affectionate supervision, and they rode up to the high ground on the northwest corner of Ira's property, where you could see a long way in every direction. They sat their horses on the ridge and looked out at the country, the dry golden hills and the cedar breaks and the thread of the creek to the west catching the late light, and the smoke of Harlan Creek visible to the south, and closer the 2 properties that were their life, the fields and the buildings and the fences they had built and maintained, the marks of years of work and decision pressed into the land. "Do you remember," Ira said, "what I said the first day I saw you?" "I remember," Esther said. "I meant it," he said. "I meant it more than I knew how to say." Esther looked out at the land she had come to with calloused hands and a proud chin and nothing else certain, and she thought about all of it, the fear she had treated as information, the work that had been its own reward, the house she had rebuilt nail by nail, the fields she had learned and the animals she had tended and the town she had joined, the man beside her who had seen her clearly from the first moment and had said so directly and without decoration. "I know you did," she said. "So did I." She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and the light was long and golden on the hills, and Harlan Creek was solid and real in the distance, and their children were safe, and their land was good, and their life was everything that life could be made to be by 2 people who refused to be anything other than what they were. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the way he had always taken her hand, as if it was simply the most obvious thing in the world, and she held it, and they sat on the high ground in the autumn light and looked at everything they had made together. The mockingbirds were calling from somewhere below the ridge. The horses were calm beneath them. The air was cool and clear, and carried the smell of cedar and turned earth and the coming of winter, which was just another season to move through with clear eyes and able hands, and the steady, undecorated love of 2 people who had found each other in the extraordinary ordinary luck of a spring morning in 1878, and had chosen each other, every day since, with the same directness and honesty and full-hearted commitment that they had brought to everything else. James Ellsworth grew up to be the kind of man his parents had raised him to be, which was capable and fair and possessed of a bone-deep relationship with the land, and an honest way of speaking that people trusted without quite knowing why. He took over the South Fields when he was old enough and managed them with the same care Esther had always brought to them. And he had his mother's eye for what the soil needed and his father's patience in giving it what it required. Clara grew up to be exactly the kind of person that people mean when they say someone is a force of nature, which she had been from her first outraged minutes in the world. She became, in time, a teacher herself, which surprised no one who had watched her explain things to younger children from the time she was 4, with the particular combination of impatience with slowness and genuine enthusiasm for understanding that makes a great teacher. She taught at the Harlan Creek schoolhouse starting in 1900, which placed her in the building her mother had helped construct, which was a symmetry that Esther found quietly perfect. Harlan Creek grew and changed through the late years of the century, as all places did, with the coming of the telephone line and improved roads and the gradual softening of the frontier edge into something more settled and familiar. The town that had felt like the edge of the world in 1878 became, by 1900, a place with a main street and a hotel and a newspaper that had been running for 16 years and a school with 2 classrooms and a sense of itself as a real and permanent place. Through all of it, the Ellsworth homesteads remained what they had always been, well-managed, productive, and honest. The land responded to that honesty, the way land does when it is cared for with intelligence and patience, giving back more than was taken from it, growing more generous over the years rather than less. In the summer of 1900, on the anniversary of their 21st year of marriage, Ira Ellsworth left a small package on the kitchen table for Esther to find in the morning. Inside was a piece of cedar, smooth and well-finished, carved with the kind of simple precision that showed more effort than ornament, and on it were the words she had first heard on the roof of her half-repaired house in the spring of 1878, from a man on a buckskin horse who had looked at her calloused hands and her proud chin and said the truest thing. She held it for a long time. Then she went out to the barn, where he was already at the morning work, and she came up behind him and put her arms around him from behind, which she did not often do because she was not a woman who was naturally given to demonstrations, but which she did now because the gesture was true and she was, after all this time, still learning from her own advice to look at what was in front of her and not look away. He covered her hands with his without turning around, and they stood in the morning light of the barn with the horses breathing around them and the smell of hay and leather, and the cedar polish she used on the harnesses. And outside the September was coming on with its slow golden progress, and the land was green and good, and James was already in the South Field and Clara would be at the schoolhouse, and this was their life, full and real and entirely their own. 21 years, she said. 21 years, he agreed. What do you think the next 21 will look like, she said. He turned then and looked at her in the familiar, direct, completely unperformed way he had always looked at her, and he said, I think they'll look like you. She laughed, and the sound of it went out through the open barn door into the warm September morning, and the horses shifted at their feed, and Sargent, who was very old now and moved slowly but still insisted on following Esther everywhere she went, thumped his tail against the floor from his corner, and the day opened around them like a hand, like the land itself, generous and clear and full of the ordinary extraordinary fact of being alive in it together. That was how it was. That was how it went on being. The land that Esther Rhodes had arrived on with calloused hands and a proud chin became, year by year and season by season, something that was inseparable from the woman who had built it up and loved it and worked it and passed it on. When people in Harlan Creek in those later years talked about the Ellsworth homesteads, they talked about them the way you talk about places that have character, places that feel like someone, places that hold in the quality of their fences and the arrangement of their fields and the deep health of their soil, the visible record of a life lived with intention. And when people talked about Esther Ellsworth, they talked about her the same way. As someone who held, in the set of her chin and the strength of her hands and the directness of her gaze, the visible record of a life in which she had decided, early and firmly and without regret, to be entirely and unapologetically real. The cowboy on the buckskin horse had seen it from the first moment. He had been right.